So in the last video, we established what the point of powerlifting nutrition was. Namely, it was 1, weight management, and 2, performance enhancement. We also established that in the service of those overarching goals, we had 3 main aims. 1 was to gain as much muscle as possible, 2 was to maintain a competitive body fat percentage, and 3 was to spend as much of our training time in a caloric surplus as we can manage. So, now that we've kind of covered the what of nutrition in the last video, in this video what we're going to discuss is the actual how. What you do to make all of these things happen from a very broad perspective. We're going to talk about the overarching strategy of powerlifting nutrition. And in subsequent videos and articles, I will be discussing the specifics of dieting, water cutting, and all of those intricate details that make this system come to life. All right, let's get started by discussing protein ratio, or P ratio. Now, for those of you who have never heard of P ratio before, what it is basically this phenomenon where as a percentage of each pound that you gain, a certain amount is going to be muscle and a certain amount is going to be fat. Same thing when you lose weight. It's always going to be a certain percentage of lean body mass that you lose and a certain percentage of fat that you lose. Now, here's the thing. P ratio is unfortunately primarily genetic. That is, just naturally, some people are going to gain more lean body mass when they gain weight, even without training or anything, than others. In fact, some studies show that a lot of people on average gain about 25% lean body mass whenever they gain weight without doing any sort of training whatsoever. And of course, the genetics are completely varied across the spectrum here, right? There's people who, whenever they lose weight, lose mostly fat. There's people who, when they lose weight, lose equal parts lean body mass and equal parts fat. Now, the good news here is that beyond genetics, we can greatly influence P ratio through our training, our nutrition, and through supplementation. Now, I'm not going to discuss supplements here, specifically for the reason that in most places they're illegal, you guys can't use them, and it's just not a subject that obviously YouTube wants me to talk about. Second, in terms of training, well, I hope you guys have your programming covered by now, and if you don't, check out the Powerlifting to Win programming series, and that should really get you started in the right direction. Obviously, the rest of this video is going to focus on the nutrition aspect of P ratio, and here's why. Influencing P ratio in a positive direction is essentially the main point of performance nutrition in a lot of ways. Not entirely, but in a lot of ways. Because for every pound that we gain, the higher the ratio of lean body mass and muscle that we get per pound, that means we can spend a longer time bulking. And the higher percentage of fat that we lose per pound loss when we're dieting, that means the quicker and more efficient our cut is going to be. So you see, by maximizing P ratio at the end of any given cutting and bulking cycle, we're going to end up with more muscle and less fat. And that is efficiency, and that is going to increase performance over our competition over time significantly. All right, let's define competitive body fat percentage. It's important to note before I go any further that the percentages I'm going to be talking about are primarily aimed at males. So if you're a female, just add between 6 to 8% body fat to all of the numbers that I'm saying, and that's going to be a lot more appropriate for your particular situation. Now, in my opinion, 15% body fat is about the upper limit in terms of competitive body fat percentage for a powerlifter. That's where we start crossing the line of how fat is too fat. And there are 3 reasons primarily that I would say 15% is a reasonable upper limit. The first reason is it is at about this percent where the hormonal milieu starts to be adversely affected by getting any fatter. In an extreme oversimplification of hormones, the fatter you get, the more estrogenic you become. You see, estrogen binds to testosterone, which decreases the amount of free testosterone that is flowing throughout your system. And of course, the less testosterone that you have, the quality of your gains is going to diminish. The second reason, which is definitely more important, is that above 15% or so, you're just going to start running into competitors who are so much leaner than you that they have an insurmountable advantage in terms of lean body mass and muscle mass. If you're in the 181 class and you're 15 or 16%, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to compete with a competitor who is 8 or 10% body fat. They're probably going to beat you no matter how well you're doing everything else. The third reason is that staying around 15% body fat keeps us within striking distance of being completely shredded if necessary. Most powerlifters have between 3 or 4 months in between meets, and if you're sitting at 20% body fat or so, that's a 5 to 6 month diet if you want to do it properly most of the time. That's just too long between meets. If you get noticed that you're going to be expected to compete in a meet that has prize money, or a big national meet that you weren't anticipating, or just something like that, some invitational, you want to be within that striking distance. And that means around 15% or so, because at 15%, you're really only 3 months away from being completely shredded at any point in time. Now, there is one exception to this whole rule of 15% body fat, and that is the super heavyweight division. For those of you guys who don't know what that is, the super heavyweight division is a division in powerlifting where there is no weight limit whatsoever. So it's actually to your advantage to weigh as much as is possible and get every ounce of lean body mass and every ounce of muscle that you can possibly carry. Now here's the thing, this weight class is really not an advantage for anybody who isn't extremely tall. Because if you're, say, 5'6" like me, and you decide to compete in the super heavyweight division, you're going to be going against lifters who are 6'5", 6'4", 6'3". Sometimes there's guys that are even like 6'7", 6'8", strongman style guys. And no matter how fat that you get, no matter how much you weigh, they're going to be able to carry more muscle than you simply because they have a bigger frame. So if you want to go head to head with those guys, be my guest, but the reality is that you're automatically putting yourself at a disadvantage in the super heavyweight division unless you're quite tall. I mean, it's really not even something to consider unless you're well above 6 feet or 180 centimeters. Now, on the other side of the coin, there is such a thing as being too lean as well. In most cases, in my opinion, you're not going to want to go below 8 to 10% body fat if you're a performance athlete like a powerlifter. Now, here's the reason why. There's several, of course. But when you get that lean, your body enters into starvation mode. And I don't really like that term, but it is somewhat of an accurate descriptor of what's going on. There are all sorts of adaptive mechanisms that kick into gear that prevent you from losing further weight, and all sorts of important processes in the body are really shut down because they're considered superfluous in times of starvation. For example, your metabolic rate is going to slow down significantly. You're going to get increased metabolic efficiency. And this means that you simply can't eat as much without gaining weight. And as we all know, the amount of energy substrates in your system is one of the key contributors to performance. If you have a full glycogen tank, you can perform longer and harder. You're also going to have more water in your system, which improves leverage as you're lifting. So when you start to get too lean and your intake gets too far down there, your training will have a diminished quality. And the second reason is that just as getting too fat can kind of mess up your hormonal milieu and lead to a worsened P ratio where you start gaining more fat than muscle per pound, you can actually get so lean that your body starts preferring to drop muscle rather than fat for metabolic efficiency reasons. And there's no real way of knowing when this is going to happen to you in particular, but it just depends on genetics. For some people around 12% body fat, they'll start losing more muscle than fat. For other people, this process doesn't start occurring until below 8% body fat. Generally, those of you who are naturally lean will be able to get leaner without ill effects, and those of you who are kind of naturally bigger are not going to be able to get as lean, but your advantage is that you're probably going to be able to carry more muscle. So you see there's a trade-off to all different types of genetics, so it is what it is, and there's absolutely no use in complaining about it whatsoever. Now, I am going to recommend 8 to 10% because I feel like that's where most people will end up after building a significant amount of muscle mass and managing their macros intelligently over time. But keep in mind that the only way for you to really know for sure is through trial and error. Personally, I started having issues, in particular on this diet, right at around 11%. That's where my metabolism really slowed down, and it started impacting my training. For you, it may be 8%. For others, it may be 12%. You just have to actually do a diet and see for yourself. Alright guys, let's talk about slow bulking. Now when I say slow bulking, I don't mean that you should try to gain like a fraction of a pound every single month or something like that, because some people legitimately try strategies like that. No, the reason why it's important to gain weight at a reasonable pace is because if you gain weight too fast, well, there's just simply a limit to the amount of protein synthesis that can occur on any given day. And beyond that limit, if there's not diminishing returns, you get 100% fat. Not diminishing returns, 100% fat gain. So let's define what I believe to be reasonable rates of slow bulking for different populations. So the first population is what I'm going to call the true novice. Now the true novice is somebody who has never lifted weights before. And for this population, I would recommend gaining between half a kilogram and a full kilogram a week, and or 1 to 2 pounds per week. And now that might seem extremely excessive and like you're definitely going to gain fat, but here's the thing, I would only recommend sustaining this rate of weight gain if you are making large jumps on a linear progression. So to put that into context, if you're still capable of 10-pound or 5-kilogram jumps on the squat and deadlift, or 5-pound or 2.5-kilogram jumps on the bench press every single session, 2 to 3 times a week, then go ahead and continue to gain weight at this pace. I see way too many novices on the PowerliftingToWin forum, true novices, who are like 5'8", 160 pounds, stalling on their squat at 220 because they never went through that initial period of gaining 1 to 2 pounds per week. You need to do it. It's going to help you build that quick base of getting like 25 to 30 pounds of muscle in your first year. Now, the second group is what I would call the advanced novice. And the advanced novice is somebody who has been training from anywhere from 3 to 6 months or so. And this type of trainee is still capable of linear progression, but they're now using smaller jumps. They are only capable of, say, adding 2.5 pounds or 1 kilo to their bench every training session. They can only add 5 pounds to their squat and deadlift, or 2.5 kilos. And at this point, if you're trying to gain weight at 1 to 2 pounds per week still, you're just going to get fat. So I would recommend that you chop your rate right in half and shoot for half a pound to 1 pound per week, and of course, a quarter of a kilo or half a kilo for those of you on the metric system. Now, the third group is what I'm just going to call everybody else. And now, of course, it's true that if you've been training for 5 years, you gain muscle even more slowly than somebody who has only been training for 1 to 2 years. However, the reality is that you're not going to approach bulking very differently, simply because if you start trying to gain weight at, say, 1/10 of a pound a week, really, that's just so small that it's impossible for you to track accurately due to minor fluctuations in lifestyle and in metabolism. It's just not tenable long term. So what I would recommend for everybody else during bulking periods is to shoot for somewhere between 0 and half a pound or 0 kilos and a quarter of a kilo per week. Now the reason why I say 0 is I would rather have you do it too slowly than do it too fast and end up getting fat needlessly. Because here's the thing, bulking, we want to spend as much time doing that as possible, right? And if you're getting fat quickly, you're going to have to spend more of the year cutting, which is going to lead to less overall gains at the end of every single year. So if you're increasing your intake because you maintained your weight last week, that's great. You're still moving in the right direction. We want to keep your intake climbing higher and higher and higher. So I'd, again, rather see you go too slowly than too fast. Instead of, if you're past that advanced novice stage, instead of thinking of it as a rate that you should shoot for, think of it as a maximum of half a pound a week. And really your goal should just be to push your intake as high as possible over a really long period of time. And that's how you're going to maximize the amount of muscle tissue that you synthesize during your bulking periods. All right, next let's talk about slow cutting. Now, my version of slow cutting really isn't slow at all. It's just that relative to some diet strategies, such as say Lyle McDonald's Rapid Fat Loss Handbook, it is quite slow. So what I recommend is that you lose between 0.6 and 0.8% of your body weight each and every single week. And for most of you guys, that's going to work out to somewhere between 1 1/4 and 1 3/4 of a pound, or in kilo terms, about a kilo to maybe a kilo and a half. Now, the reason why I recommend losing at a slower rate is the way that I suggest dieting in general. Now, I'm going to save the specifics, like I said, for future videos and articles, but I don't believe in taking out huge chunks of caloric intake at a time. I make very small adjustments on a weekly basis, and the reason for this is I want to keep my intake as high as is absolutely possible while still achieving my weight loss goals. If you do it this way, the average amount of food that you intake during the course of your diet is going to be much higher than somebody who just hacks and slashes every time they hit a plateau, right? The second thing is that if you attempt to diet too quickly, and for most of you guys who aren't really heavy, that's like over 2 pounds a week or so, just the way the math works out, there's nothing special about that number. You're going to negatively influence P ratio and start losing a higher percentage of muscle relative to fat. And of course, we don't want that to happen. We want to keep our hard-earned muscle mass, right? Right? I'm right. Now, again, even though I'm calling this slow cutting, you should still be losing weight at anywhere from 2 to 3 times the rate that you're gaining weight. So that still means that we're spending maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the year bulking rather than cutting, and that's just a great ratio to make gains at the end of the year. Now that we've covered slow cutting and slow bulking, I want to present to you guys the revised edition of the Eating to Win strategy in a nutshell. And to give credit where credit is due, this strategy is largely adopted from Lyle McDonald. Without further ado though, here is the strategy. 1, you are going to slow bulk up until you hit 15% body fat or so. 2, then you are going to slow cut down to 8 to 10% body fat. Whenever you have a meet coming up, you're going to use a combination of dieting just before the meet and water cutting to get into the lightest weight class possible while still being in a competitive body fat percentage, both in terms of not going past your minimum leanness and your maximum fatness. And that's really all there is to it, guys. You just repeat this process over and over again, accumulating more muscle over time. Moving forward, in the next video and article, what I'm going to discuss is the principles and the fundamentals that underlie any performance-based diet. So we're going to be able to set up a foundation where we can review diets just like we did in the programming review series. So if you found this content interesting so far, make sure you tune in for the next video because it's going to be a good one. If you guys found this content interesting, informative, or entertaining, you know what to do. Like, share, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. Please send this out into the interwebs for me. And of course, don't forget to check out PowerliftingToWin.com for more great powerlifting information. And above all else, have a nice day, my friends.